Today we're going to conclude our discussion of the topic of pollution. There are still several different issues under the heading of this topic that I want to get at. We'll start by talking about sublethal effects of certain pollutants, notably pesticides, and then we will consider several different issues that will ultimately lead us to the topic of environmental sustainability. So let's begin by looking at this picture right here. This is a picture that I took a very long time ago, the summer of 1974. And what we're looking at here is the Connecticut River in southern Connecticut. It's a very idyllic kind of a landscape. However, it was a landscape that had some significant things wrong with it, even though you couldn't see them. Some very insidious sorts of chemicals were present in this environment, which had a catastrophic effect on some of the wildlife of this region. In that water column that you see here, and especially in the sediments, like in the exposed mudflat that you see over on the right-hand side of this image, there were a concentration of toxic chemicals. There was the pesticide DDT, which had been used in the Connecticut River Valley for a number of years. And there was also contamination with the chemical that we've talked about previously, polychlorinated biphenyls. And these chemicals had the effect of not directly poisoning wild animals, but they had the effect of accumulating in the food chain from one trophic level to the next, so that the animals at the top of the trophic pyramid were receiving concentrations of these chemicals that were great enough to interfere with their physiology. This bird right here, the osprey, which is a fish-eating, coastal dwelling kind of a species, it also lives around large lakes. This species was differentially affected, being at the top of the food chain as it is. In the 1940s, the Connecticut River Valley hosted somewhere upwards of around 200 pairs of this species, one of their largest concentrations anywhere on planet Earth. This is a species that occurs over much of the planet, so the fact that right here in southern New England we had a concentration like that is quite remarkable. Notice that this bird here is carrying a little nesting material, by the way. Well, by 1974, when I began studying this system, there was one pair of birds left, and you're looking at one of them right here. The initial cause of the decline was at first kind of mystifying. Raccoons and other predators were at first blamed for bringing down numbers of this species. And so back in the 1960s, nesting platforms like these were built all over the lower Connecticut River in an effort to get birds up away from predators. Many of them were nesting right on the ground, on the surface of coastal marshes and places like that. And so the thinking was, by getting them up on nest platforms, we could reduce nest predation. But despite those efforts, birds continued to decline through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And about that same time, a very important book in the history of conservation was published by the scientist Rachel Carson, who wrote a book called Silent Spring, which took a look at the effect of pesticides on wildlife. And with that kind of impetus, researchers started taking a very hard look at what was going on with pesticides and how they might affect the physiology of birds like the osprey. By the late 1960s, the mechanisms at work had been reasonably well worked out, and what it appeared to be was that being exposed to sublethal doses of DDT, which accumulated from the mud to microorganisms to bigger organisms to bigger organisms to little fish to bigger fish to the fish that ospreys ate, was that these pesticides interfered with calcium metabolism. And calcium is one of the key ingredients in eggs. The shells of eggs are made of, to a significant degree, calcium carbonate, along with proteins and other things, just like you see in this picture here. And what was being observed in the 1960s was a phenomenon that was referred to then as thin eggshell syndrome, where birds were laying eggs with shells that were so thin that the eggs were cracking, hence never hatching. And so as people took a hard look at this, they started to realize that it was reproductive success that was declining dramatically in populations of ospreys in many locations, not just along the Connecticut River, but in many kinds of places. And it wasn't just ospreys that were experiencing these precipitous declines. During those same years, the bald eagle was also disappearing from large portions of its range, including places like southern New England, where it pretty much became extinct as a breeder by the 60s. And again, when people took a look at what was going on, it was again related to this thin eggshell phenomenon. So when I first began working on the Connecticut River back in the early 1970s, there were no longer any bald eagles nesting on the Connecticut River, or for that matter, anywhere in Connecticut, not to mention Massachusetts and Rhode Island. There were a few pairs that were hanging around acting like they were thinking of breeding, but there wasn't much evidence of any real breeding activity. And then there was this bird here, the Cooper's hawk. Now the bald eagle, like the osprey, is a fish eater primarily, but the Cooper's hawk, which was at one time in the early years of the 20th century probably the commonest forest hawk in New England, by the 1960s they had been virtually eliminated as a breeder throughout much of this region, as well as throughout large portions of eastern North America. There were still some populations in the west that were doing okay, but the east had been pretty much depopulated of Cooper's hawks. Now, Cooper's hawks are often also referred to by farmers as chicken hawks because they will take chickens, and in fact they are primarily a bird eater. And if you think of what things like songbirds eat, if you think of robins eating worms and bugs and things like that, and those bugs in turn are eating littler things which might be eating plants which are growing in soil that is contaminated with agricultural chemicals like pesticides. Well, Cooper's hawk again sits at the top of the food chain, and so it was accumulating these sublethal doses of chemicals like DDT, and it also was experiencing thin eggshell syndrome. And Cooper's hawks, being not as long-lived as some of these other species, really just disappeared. Once upon a time, back in those years, I can remember spending months in the field in the summertime, the height of the breeding season, and neither seeing nor hearing a single Cooper's hawk anywhere in the forest. Now, I can see them in my own backyard. They've made, like the eagle and the osprey, considerable comeback. This comeback can be attributed in large part to the banning of these various toxic chemicals and their subsequent long-term decline in presence in the environment. So let's summarize some of these ideas. The initial one is that if there is some sort of toxin, such as a pesticide that's been released into the environment, even if its concentrations in the physical environment might be small, as organisms at the bottom of the food chain like plants and things like that pick up these and are then eaten by animals, the amount in each one of these plants gets concentrated into the bodies of individual animals. When these animals in turn get eaten by bigger animals, the concentrations in each one of their bodies gets included into the tissues of this next animal on the food chain, and so on, until you reach the top of the food chain, where the concentrations are then greatest. This phenomenon is called biomagnification. So what was observed especially in top carnivores like various predatory birds like Cooper's hawks and ospreys and eagles and so on, was that the concentrations these individuals were getting were high enough to cause problems. In some cases, the concentrations were actually great enough to cause direct lethal effects. So acute poisoning from things like some of these persistent pesticides in the chlorinated hydrocarbon class. Birds were actually being picked up in tremors from the concentrations that they had obtained through their prey. Although more commonly what was observed was sublethal, chronic kinds of effects, such as effects on calcium metabolism. These pesticides interfered with the mobilization of calcium from the bones of birds to the eggshell manufacturing mechanism. Hence, birds were laying thin eggshells that were ultimately not having a very high hatching success. And without any young being produced, numbers of these species started declining precipitously over a period of several decades until there were virtually, in many cases, none left. Now, as I've said, many of these species have, since the early 1970s, rebounded strongly. The osprey, which was down to a single pair in 1974, is now represented in places like the Connecticut River by many pairs. It could be upwards of 100 pairs by now, although I haven't seen the latest estimates and I haven't been able to find them. But numbers have really mushroomed in recent years. Same thing is true of bald eagles. There was not one active nest in the state of Connecticut. I don't think there was one in Massachusetts or Rhode Island either in the early 1970s. And there are now a fair number of nests across the region. The same is true of Cooper's hawks, which, although virtually eliminated in the 1970s, are now represented by pretty strong populations throughout this region. And these trends are not just true of southern New England, they are true continent-wide. Now let's turn our attention to some topics that we've talked a bit about previously. You might recall from the previous episode we discussed the issue of Superfund sites, sites designated by Environmental Protection Agency as being areas that had been seriously polluted, usually by some sort of industry, like this thread mill that you see in the background here, that then need to be cleaned up. So the question that comes out of that is exactly what happens when we do try to clean a place like this up. And there are a number of steps, some of which are in common with plain old municipal landfills, but they tend to go a level beyond that. So, for example, when we remove toxic substances from a site like this to a hazardous waste landfill, these landfills will have special kinds of drainage systems to collect any liquid leachate that comes out of it, and then these materials can be treated further. The hazardous waste landfill usually has multiple kinds of layers to keep anything from percolating into groundwater beneath the landfill. Various kinds of impervious surfaces, including plastic and clay and concrete and things like that. And then also there are various sorts of approaches to removing some of these things, breaking them down to non-toxic substances. Bacteria can be used, much like it is in septic systems, to break down organic compounds into harmless substances. Another technique that's used is called phytoremediation, where plants can be used to remove toxics, including toxic metals, from soils, and then the plants can be harvested and dealt with further in order to eliminate toxic waste from a site. Sometimes plants can also, like bacteria, be used in breaking down some substances that are toxic, turning them into non-toxic kinds of things. So here is a diagram from a U.S. military base, actually generated by the U.S. military, showing one of these toxic waste landfills, where you have a leachate collection system, you have various layers of plastic and clay that make this landfill impervious to movement of leachate out of it. You have a situation here where this landfill is capped, and we actually talked about this again in the previous program, where once the landfill is filled up, you can cap it with soil and you can put on a vegetative layer. And this vegetative layer can do several different things. It can hold the soil in place, but it can also be used in terms of phytoremediation, where the plants can actually absorb or in one way or another detoxify substances in the landfill. So in terms of phytoremediation, here's one plant that can be used for that. This is the trunk of a poplar tree, and especially certain kinds of poplars can be planted on the surface of areas where materials need to be absorbed. And that's what the roots of the poplar do, is they actually absorb contaminants from the soil. So it's referred to as phytoextraction of wastes that are toxic. Now this photograph here would appear to have nothing to do with phytoremediation, and indeed it doesn't. This is a formal garden, but there is a plant within this formal garden that is rather effective at breaking down certain classes of toxic contaminants. That willow that you see way in the background on the left-hand side, willows can also be used to detoxify. This phenomenon is referred to as phytodegradation. Now, still a third class of plants carry on something called phytostabilization. They don't absorb the materials into their tissues or break them down, but what they do is to adsorb them, or in some other way stabilize the material that's in the soil and keep it from moving elsewhere. So by adsorbing onto the roots, that holds that material in place. By precipitating the material into the root zone of the soil, A plant can also keep contaminants from reaching nearby groundwater. Now, we still have a few other topics to discuss before we leave environmental pollution altogether. One of these topics is referred to as environmental risk analysis. And what this means is that the risks of some kinds of pollutant, some kinds of contaminant, are assessed to determine what kind of chances there are that these things could impact human health or some other kinds of environmental phenomenon. These kinds of dangerous substances are often referred to as stressors, and these are things that influence the physical, chemical, or biological environment, producing some kind of bad phenomenon. We've seen in the case of birds and other kinds of wildlife how a bioaccumulation of materials can result in their population collapses and elimination of them from the food web, for example. So it's not just humans that we are concerned with, although in many cases what happens to other animals is an indicator of what could be affecting human populations as well. So what conservationists do is to use a formal kinds of risk analysis protocol to determine just how dangerous is some toxic in the environment or some kind of pollution, to evaluate the magnitude of the risk to people. And then they can use the data to develop various kinds of protection strategies like toxic waste landfills and those kinds of phenomena. So typically these risk assessments include measurements of the amount of contaminants present, the toxicity of the contaminant, and the potential for exposure of these contaminants to either the environment or to people. Related to environmental risk analysis is the concept of the dose-response relationship. This is something that pharmacologists consider in terms of drug effects on people as well, but it can also be applied to pollution kinds of situations where if there's a certain dose of a pollutant in the environment, how dangerous is that to human or ecosystem health? And so by considering dose-response relationships, one can develop models that predict the effect of toxins at various concentrations of it. Often the relationship between dose and response is not linear like you see in this graph here. Sometimes with certain kinds of substances, greater concentrations of the substance don't necessarily lead to a concomitant increase in risk. Sometimes the relationship kind of flattens out so that much of the effect is felt at lower concentrations. On the other hand, other kinds of substances may not reach toxic levels until the dose is quite high. A concept that goes along with the dose-response relationship is the concept of the LD50, which refers to the dose which is lethal to 50% of the organisms that are exposed to it. These kinds of relationships are often worked out in the laboratory using laboratory mice and things like that. Animals with some kind of physiology which is, at least in a general way, similar to human physiology. Another issue to consider is that of the economic impacts of pollution, something which is often done by environmental agencies is a cost-benefit analysis, where we take a look at how much is it going to cost to clean up some environmental issue This is often quite considerable because of the sophisticated kinds of technology that have to be employed in order to eliminate some toxin of some sort or other. And in addition to the direct costs, one must also consider external costs, which are those that are incurred by others who are not directly involved in causing the pollution. So, in other words, in addition to those people who are directly paying for the cleanup, there's other people who might have their businesses or homes affected by this toxin who then have to spend additional money to clean up issues that arise in their own property or business. Now, the benefits of cleanup include things like removing toxins that could have a negative impact on human health. And in this regard, a cost-benefit analysis is one that we might consider to be a false choice, because who wants to be in the 1% of people who might be still affected by some toxin because it is deemed too expensive to clean up the last bit of this stuff? Now, additional benefits of cleanup, in addition to things like human health, could be improved ecosystem function. Remember that not just humans are affected by toxins or other manners of pollutants. There are many examples of this kind of phenomenon, but let's take a look at one reasonably recent example: the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, which cost billions of dollars to clean up because of the technical complexity of capping an oil well that was very deep in the ocean. It was basically uncharted territory for the people involved in that cleanup. And then there were all of the cleanup costs associated with the oil on the surface of the water, in the water column, oil hitting the shore, oil poisoning coastal wetlands, and so on and so on. So the cost was enormous. But the benefits of that cleanup were quite diverse. Think, for example, of the protection of the coastal wetlands. Now, of course, the wetlands themselves function in a number of different ways in this larger Gulf of Mexico ecosystem. They provide an enormous amount of primary productivity, and this primary productivity supports all of the organisms that live in the estuarine waters. So, for example, many kinds of economically important fish live in tidal creeks and are ultimately connected to that coastal marsh food web. All of the organisms that are harvested out of the Gulf of Mexico then are related in one way or another to much of what goes on in these coastal wetlands. So the Gulf fisheries, the Gulf shrimp harvest. We can also consider the fact that these coastal wetlands act as buffers for storm effects, and when wetlands are present, they can act a bit like a giant sponge to soak up a lot of the water and energy of a storm, so that the uplands behind them are far less impacted and damaged in a whole host of different ways than they would be if those wetlands were absent. So we are now down to the final image in our long discussion of the topic of environmental pollution. And this last image reminds us of the importance of sustainability. To live in an environment which is sustainable over time. So sustainable resources are those that can be used indefinitely. And pathways to sustainability include some of the things we've been talking about. Things like recycling of resources, reuse of resources, regrowing, resources that we have consumed in the case of biological resources. But we have to keep in mind that sustainability also requires us to deal with wastes in such a manner that we detoxify these wastes or recycle them in such a manner that we can have an environment which we can persist in over the long term. And on this final point, we will close our discussion of environmental pollution, and we will begin next time with a new topic.